So why did Washington State's new governor, Bob Ferguson, go public with a proposal to actually do a small cut in Washington State's government expenditures rather than just endorse outgoing Governor Inslee's absurd recommendation to impose a wealth tax in Washington State? Is it actually possible that I might agree with Ferguson even just a little bit on this one? Well, we're going to dive into the details on this video today as Washington State's legislative session gets underway in Olympia. And well, it's always scary when the politicians come to town for a few months because your freedom and certainly your wallet are always at greatest risk when our legislature's in session. It won't always be bad news. Now, before we do this, however, let me just kind of remind you to hit the like and subscribe buttons on this video channel down below if you don't already subscribe. You can do so, and it just costs you nothing, only a few seconds of your time. If you think I've missed something in this video, and I probably have, let me know in the comment section down below. I really appreciate those. And just don't forget to share this video with others who actually may want to know more about what is happening in the Pacific Northwest, and maybe how some of our political class's worst concepts are tested here first before they come to harm your state next. So now let's just dive into this current subject. Many of my viewers were surprised that the incoming new governor of Washington State, our former state attorney general Bob Ferguson, did not immediately jump on the typical tax bandwagon as our bureaucracy kind of panics just a little bit about a very predictable shortfall in taxes being extracted from Washington State residents over the next few years. In fact, Governor Ferguson here, sorry, I always said Governor Inslee, Governor Ferguson came out and actually claimed that he would be looking for an across-the-board 6% budget cut on a handful of state agencies first, and then a few four-year state colleges before considering any new taxes. Now, that's basically what he actually said. Now, of course, the truth is a bit more nuanced than this headline and some of these headline quotes actually might suggest. And we all know politicians actually don't tell the truth. Oftentimes they do lie. Now, one of the reasons people were actually pretty surprised is that as our easily forgotten and now former Governor Jay Inslee, he's kind of fading away on his way out the door. As this is kind of Inslee's habit, he, of course, left some proverbial piles of garbage or wormy apples on his way out of the governor's mansion. For example, Inslee proposed and prompted all kinds of taxes in his final draft budget proposal. This was including the headliner, which was promoting the guaranteed to fail concept of a wealth tax. Now, I say guaranteed to fail because, while some Democrats have called it untested, this actually isn't true. This destructive and ineffective tax has been tested in other countries quite frequently, and it pretty much always fails, unless the goal was just to hurt the country or the place trying to actually implement it in the first place. Now, Ferguson, rarely for a Democrat in Washington State, he actually expressed strong skepticism of this very dumb tax idea. Now, for those with a little bit more political memory or perhaps nostalgia, you're going to remember that Inslee ran for governor originally in 2012 on a platform of absolutely not going to raise any of your taxes. And then, of course, he promptly proved once again that he was always a pathological liar by immediately spending the rest of his 12 years occupying the governor's mansion, pushing for every tax concept and increase that he could find, anything he could cram through the legislature. And usually he could only do this during the cycles that he had a Democrat majority. But unlike Inslee, however, Ferguson's actually never promised that he wouldn't raise taxes. And everyone pretty much expected him to do just that when he gets the chance. So why didn't Ferguson here just come out and say so right away? I mean, this is actually a good question because the Democrats control all levers of political power in Washington State, and they can, in theory, basically do any crazy thing that they want. So what is stopping them at this point? Now, this is where we actually get into the details of the proposed Ferguson budget cuts. Now, by the way, I do support Ferguson's budget cuts in concept. I mean, assuming they are actually implemented. But they clearly are not big enough cuts, and I'll get into some of my own helpful suggestions for budget cuts later in this video. Now, first, Ferguson's budget cut proposal, while I support it as a starting point, it clearly isn't enough, and he is missing substantial areas where the state could actually make much more sweeping budget cuts. He's putting this off the table, or basically promoting it kicking it down the road, where it is obvious that the cuts are clearly needed. And I do agree with Ferguson not planning to cut any of the public safety budget. I mean, this was actually quite shrewd, and particularly in light of the California meltdown on public display right now. Protecting public safety is actually critical because these departments have generally suffered in recent years with an incompetent leadership and are actually part of some of the very critical components of just basically functioning local government. And we actually probably need this, and we need to retain it if we don't want to end up worse than California. But most importantly, I think anyway, Ferguson leaves the education part of the state budget as immune to budget cuts. Now, the state level, public education is roughly about 42% of the budget. So essentially, the proposed 6% budget cuts, it really just starts to pale in comparison to the expected shortfalls that we're likely to see over the next 4 years or so. And I would definitely put OSPI, which stands for Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, under a microscope for budget cuts, even if only to just clean house on some of the bloated bureaucrats who work there and then do nothing to actually help educate children. However, the Washington Education Association, their union here, is a very powerful and abusive special interest, and they helped elect Ferguson in the first place, so he does owe them one for sure. Now, keep in mind, assuming our bureaucrats are actually being honest, and that's a very risky and dangerous assumption, our state's actually going to be short about $10 billion or $12 billion, or maybe it's $16 billion over the next 4 years. Yeah, that number actually does keep changing, just depending on which person is interpreting the numbers, which, like our climate change models, they are usually flawed forecasts. However, just for the sake of argument today, let's just take the middle number, which is $12 billion, and assume that this is kind of the magic number for budget cutting projections that are coming. Now, Ferguson's budget cut proposals only reduce the state budget by $4 billion, or roughly 30% of the amount the state needs to cut. So while Ferguson is dancing around the issue right now, this is because he would prefer to not discuss the tax side of covering the gap, at least until he can properly negotiate the final details, most of which, frankly, are just going to be done behind closed doors with the Democrats and special interests, and then the final budget hearing's going to be rushed out in the final days of this legislative session in about 3 months or so, with very little time for any of us to review the details before our legislature passes it, usually in the dead of the night when nobody's paying attention. However, it was very smart for Ferguson to pretend that he is fiscally responsible right now, and he is purposely using his public statements to make Inslee appear appropriately crazy on Inslee's way out the door. Now, where is Inslee actually headed? Well, most people expect that he's going to end up at one of the corporate entities, whether they call it a nonprofit or a for-profit. There's really very little difference anymore. And one of these entities who are basically beneficiaries of some of the billions of dollars that Inslee shoveled out the door under his abusive Climate Commitment Act scam from just a few years ago, which is one of the reasons why you're paying a lot more in gas right now. Now, one primary reason Ferguson would highlight this difference between him and Inslee is that it makes Ferguson look more reasonable, and it does. I mean, now you may ask, why does he care about that? Well, just like all politicians, he has future aspirations, and just like Inslee, Ferguson is eyeing the White House. Most governors do, and well, that campaign is far away and likely a forlorn hope for Governor Ferguson. He is still going to aspire to get to the big house someday, or at least take his shot. Political insiders in Washington observed Inslee's crash and burn when Inslee had its aborted presidential campaign, and it blew up so spectacularly in 2020, almost as bad as Kamala's failed campaign at the same time. So Ferguson is going to play it just a bit more conservatively right now to at least keep his options open and make him seem a little bit saner than the other choices. Now, this position also gives Ferguson some talking points to cover when he can look like the adult in the room, basically telling the Democrats in the legislature that their proposed budgets and tax plans are just too high or absurd or insane. And really, the Democrats in the legislature get to politically win this way too, because they can basically virtue signal to the crazy left that they really are down with the struggle, and they can propose exceptionally dumb ideas, knowing full well in advance that nobody needs to suffer the consequences of their craziness. Since Ferguson, he's not going to approve or sign, or maybe possibly with just a little bit of political theater, even veto some of the crazier budget stuff that the goofs in Olympia end up dumping on his desk in late spring. You got to think kind of like kabuki theater. None of the political posturing is really real. And remember, Washington State allows a section veto for the governor. It's not quite a line item veto, but better than no partial veto at all. So Ferguson can actually impress people with his green eye-shade concerns for the budget. Everyone wins, and the Republicans remain an afterthought, or at least a footnote, in this legislative session. At least this is the current Democrat plan as it stands today. Now, don't get me wrong, there is a place for the Republicans who are deep in the minority this session. First, they can propose good bills that basically provide a contrast with the Dem proposals. And these are not only basically going to be voted on by the majority in the legislature, but they at least provide a contrast from people who should know the reality of math and good governance. So this is what you actually do when you just don't have the political power to stop anything. Secondly, the Republicans can actually be unified in their opposition to the dumb ideas, particularly the bad ones, the real bad ones, that are sure to advance the session, and then they can do an effective job maybe finding just a few Democrats and the people over there on that side of the aisle anyway, who for reasons, very specific reasons, are going to oppose maybe that policy or this one as well. This isn't as easy as it sounds, but this is how it is usually done in Olympia. And even though there are very few Democrats left in Olympia who actually believe math is real or who can get over their own pronoun selection, there actually are some. However, after the virtue signaling is done and the political posturing is documented for future campaign fundraising efforts, there still remains budget cuts to be implemented. And it never hurts to propose some ideas and some ideas of our own that can help our dear governor and the political class in their at least pretend budget cutting proposals. Now, I'm actually glad to see Ferguson specifically mention the four-year state educational institutions, which are sometimes mistakenly called places of learning today. And these are in desperate need of budget cuts. Ferguson's proposed 3% cut, or it might have been a 4% cut on that. But anyway, it won't do much. But I'd recommend a 10% cut in this area, perhaps starting with laying off maybe 30% of the administrative staff, most of whom nobody's going to miss. They don't teach students, and large numbers of this top-heavy, very bloated, highly compensated administrative staff have just become cushy and expensive six-figure paychecks for provosts, deans, and just random bureaucrats, just feeding on the gravy train of the state. Now, additionally, putting perhaps the Evergreen State College here out of its misery and finally admitting that this educational experiment has failed would actually save the state a lot of money and reduce the pipeline for future bureaucrats, who basically won't have jobs now after graduation anyway. So two birds with one stone here. I think it's a good idea. The students left in the lurch here, they can actually finish up at the local community college, and then the campus can actually be used for a drug rehab facility or a future Department of Corrections location, or maybe another location for a psychiatric facility since Western States failed so badly. Heck, the state could even sell it to a for-profit enterprise if they can find any business willing to take the risk of relocating to Washington State, particularly that close to Olympia. Now, Ferguson could also look closer at Western Washington University, where scandals of ghost classes and recent litigation revealed a complete lack of financial control. Yeah, it actually isn't a good idea to fire your auditor because they actually want you to follow the law. Perhaps a 30% downsizing for that place would actually be very helpful for the taxpayers as well. Now, the state could also save money if they just made a much more serious cut in the upper management of most of the state agencies. Not 6%, which is just kind of playing around the edges, but serious 30 to 40% reductions in upper management, most of which can actually be streamlined. Just like we've seen in other examples, perhaps like at Twitter or X now, you can actually downsize 80% of your highly compensated workforce at the upper levels and still function quite well. In fact, you probably won't even notice when they're gone, and the world will be a better place for it, and the taxpayers will save a lot. In addition to cutting back on out-of-state travel, which was referenced by Ferguson, the state could just simply impose a total ban on out-of-state travel funded by the state for basically the next 5 years. I mean, no more junkets to Las Vegas or California, New York, or Hawaii, or just wherever, or for whatever excuses that they just frequently use. These taxpayer-funded vacations are and really should be over now and moving forward. In a more substantial way, the state could actually save money by just ending most of the state's subsidized grants, most of which actually just tend to be political grifting operations anyway. Billions of dollars tend to be just doled out in pointless, unaudited projects that produce very little to no tangible value and really only serve as a foundation for the grifters to come back next year for an even larger, unaccountable, wasted grant from the taxpayers. Now, another idea would be simply to eliminate some agencies, like here, this little one, the Puget Sound Partnership, which only saves the state tens of millions of dollars, but nobody's going to miss them when they're gone anyway. Now, listen, budget cuts, they open up all kinds of opportunities to downsize government, and in most cases, these are doubly helpful to the people who actually live here. First, because it saves us from more abuse of taxes, but secondly, because we can actually stop funding many of these wasteful grifting operations that really only serve to harm our community in the first place. So while Ferguson and I will probably agree on very little moving forward, and I'm fully aware that this is just a posturing, virtue signaling effort on his part, perhaps we can actually get some small cuts to our abusive and incompetent government now, and then seek more opportunities to downsize even more in the near future. I'm sure that our Democrat legislators are never looking for ways to save taxpayer dollars, but it never hurts for you to forward suggestions to them right now as the legislative session begins, at least just to let them know that you're paying attention. Email them some of these ideas and others that you might have so that their staff can start to report the ideas that you send. I mean, they actually may appear to be ignoring you, but if you don't ask, you certainly won't get it either. And the sooner that we start these conversations, the better off we're all going to be. Of course, to do this, you're going to need to be willing to show up, even for something as simple as sending your legislator an email. It does require you to take a few minutes and show up. It really does matter, even if it seems very small today. It matters because the future belongs to those who actually show up.